No lies, no distortions, just the facts and the truth about issues that matter. Facts First with Christian Esguerra.
Good morning. I'm Christian Esguerra, and welcome to another episode of our Facts First podcast. Okay, we know that we are in the middle of the election season here in the Philippines. We are in the thick of the campaign, less than a month ago before the May 9 presidential election. And we know that the survey frontrunner is no less than the son of the late dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. His namesake, his son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., is leading in major surveys now. So if you're going to believe the surveys, there is a big likelihood that he would win the elections. But also we know that Vice President Leandro Bredo is gaining a lot of ground, gaining a lot of momentum at second place. Now, in the thick of the election season, we have been witnessing a deluge of fake news, of disinformation, not just misinformation, about the Marcoses, about the ill-gotten wealth. What facts that have long been established before are now being assailed, revised, or outright denied. Okay, so for this episode, we're very fortunate to have a very special guest, someone who actually sought to recover the Marcos ill-gotten wealth. So we'd like to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. How much ill-gotten wealth there is still to be recovered and other related matters. I'd like to introduce to you, again, it's our pleasure to have with us on this podcast, on this Facts First episode, attorney Robert Swift. He was the one who won this landmark Hawaii class action suit worth nearly $2 billion for nearly 10,000 victims of martial law. Attorney Swift, thank you for joining us. Nice to hear from you again.
Well, it's nice to be speaking with you again, Christian.
How are you, sir? It's been a while since we last
Good.
spoke with each other. I think it was 3 years ago or 4 years ago.
It's 19.
Yeah, the last time we were here in the Philippines for the distribution of checks for the
That's
Marcos
right.
victims, right? How are you? What keeps you busy these days?
Well, I've been very busy trying to recover more money for the and I've been focused on what we call the monies, which total around $40 million, which were uh, located in an account at Merrill Lynch in New York,
Okay.
being the Panamanian corporation that was set up by Campos for Ferdinand Marcos.
So you're talking about the Arelma accounts.
That's correct.
Okay. Before we go into the details of your tedious effort to recover the ill-gotten wealth or a portion of the ill-gotten wealth, let's talk about your opinion on the kind of disinformation that has been happening here in the Philippines. For example, supporters, loyalists of the Marcoses are claiming there is no ill-gotten wealth. The Marcoses had long been rich or wealthy even before they came into office. How would you respond to that based on your own findings, based on your own efforts to recover the ill-gotten wealth?
I think the Marcos had, through Ferdinand Marcos, had significant wealth before he became president, but it substantially while he was president. So there's no that he obtained ill-gotten wealth during his presidency, but he also had other wealth. And therein that the Philippine government has sought to obtain his entire wealth and not leave anything for creditors, such as the class members, to recover.
Okay. So now, in terms of numbers, how much really is the Marcos ill-gotten wealth? Because the estimates that we have been getting was between $5 million and $10 million. Based on your estimate, how much is the total Marcos ill-gotten wealth, and how much has been recovered, at least from your end?
I don't think Right. I don't think we'll ever know. The PCGG estimates that are based on money obtained in parties, as well as from Ferdinand Marcos. But the total amount is substantial. I'm sure the total Marcos is was between $5 and $10 billion, 1986.
Mhm.
And in the interim, I'm sure that it has been moved around and placed in different locales where uh, it's very difficult to inquire as to the legitimacy of it.
Okay, so the estimate of $5 billion up to $10 billion, that's just an estimate back in 1986. So definitely it's much larger now. Is that correct?
Uh, at least what has not been spent.
Mm.
If Bong Bong is using some of that money for his election, then I'm sure he's spending a substantial amount of it.
Okay. In the first place, based on your experience, why is it so difficult to recover the stolen money from the Marcoses?
It has been extremely difficult, in part because uh, has only been able to execute in the United States. The courts of the Philippines, for reasons I don't understand, have been unwilling thus far to the U.S. judgments that I obtained. There are two judgments. One, the $2 judgment that you mentioned, but there's also a contempt judgment, which is against Bong Bong and Imelda personally, and that is about $160 million.
So you mentioned the two suits, right? So the landmark Hawaii class action suit in 1995, which is still being enforced, or you have been trying to enforce that because that's big money. Let's put, and then of course the contempt decision against Imelda Marcos. Is that correct? So you have
That's
two.
right.
Okay. Okay, before let's put things in perspective. Talk to us about the three parallel efforts to recover the Marcos ill-gotten wealth. It's important for people to understand this. One is the effort coming from the Philippine government, mainly through the Presidential Commission on Good Government. Number two, the effort to recover the Marcos ill-gotten wealth from you as representative of the Marcos victims who won that landmark ruling in 1995 in Hawaii. And number three, the estate of the late Roger Rojas. Talk to us about how these three parallel efforts somehow relate to each other.
Uh, well, of course, the government of the Philippines has had the advantage of having the Swiss government and the U.S. assisting it in various ways, but principally to aid and identify specific accounts. As a private on behalf of the class, I had to use recovery, that is depositions and document requests in order to information. But I have had some success. I mentioned earlier, I've made 3 distributions of money.
Okay, let's talk about the Hawaii class action suit in 1995. This is landmark, but it hasn't been recognized or enforced by the Philippine courts, by the Philippine government. Okay, in the first place, talk to us about the nature of that case, the Alien Tort Act or law in the United States. That was the one that was the basis, right? When you sued the Marcoses in a Hawaii court.
That's right. American law allowed me to bring suit under 200-year-old statute that permitted aliens obtain damages against the perpetrator of abuses. Human rights abuses are very narrowly construed. So the ones that the class prevailed on were torture, summary execution, disappearance. And together with a U.S. judge, adjudicated that. In addition, there were in the U.S. courts which affirmed the award.
So basically, the basis was Marcos martial law victims sued him in Hawaii on the basis of the Alien Tort Law. If you committed a crime, even outside the jurisdiction of the United States, you can be sued because that is a violation of international law. Is that correct?
That's right. Although in civil law, we don't talk about a crime, we talk about liability for an abuse that occurred.
Yeah, damages.
Abuse could also be a crime, but as a litigator and not a prosecutor, I could not bring that.
Okay. So the amount of damages that was ordered by the Hawaii court was close to $2 billion. How much of that, in short, simply put, this is the amount of money that should go to the members of the class, meaning those who sued Marcos in Hawaii, right? Now, how much of that has been recovered and distributed to the victims?
Because I was limited to to going after assets that were in the United States, I've only been successful in recovering $37 million, which has been distributed to the class members.
$37 million out of 2 billion US dollars only.
Well, 2 billion is a number, but I now, in addition to having proven liability, I have to find the assets. And the Marcoses were uncooperative in identifying those assets.
Of course, we know that they have been uncooperative, but how do you exactly recover those assets in the United States and enforce that $2 billion ruling?
Well, I have to first identify an asset, and then I have to sue over it, and I have to establish liability. The Marcoses have never paid any part of the judgment voluntarily.
So they've been resisting that, but that is established fact. They have been sued in court, and that judgment has been made in favor of the victims, right? That one is very clear.
That's right, and the judgments continue for a number of years. For example, the personal judgment against Imelda and Bong Bong continues to the year 2031. So if Bong Bong is able to amass assets and I'm able to recover any of those, the class members will benefit.
Okay. Now, so that has an expiration year, so 2031. How about the Hawaii class action judgment of nearly $2
Right.
billion?
That will continue roughly to the same period of time, and that is against the estate of Ferdinand Marcos.
Wait, so if you can't recover the remaining balance of the close to $2 billion class action suit or award by 2031, that's it?
Well, there's a graveyard of uncollected judgments in every court. And we've really done the best we can to identify and go after any assets that the Marcoses had obtained.
But is that correct? That's the end of it. If by the end of 2031, you fail to recover any remaining balance of that $2 billion judgment, that's it.
Well, that's what the law provides, that judgments expire as of a certain time. I've managed to perpetuate the judgments longer than most judgments.
Okay, because it's been 27 years since the judgment was made, and you have recovered only $37 million. So it's close to impossible. It's impossible to recover the rest of the judgment given the tight deadline that you have now.
Well, the Marcoses had limited assets in the United States. They were also secreted and concealed. So it took a great deal of effort. And we're still litigating over the Arelma assets.
Okay. Let's talk about those that have been recovered first. uh, what were these assets that you were able to recover? And perhaps I think these were converted into cash, right? Some of them were sold to be able to convert them into cash to be distributed to the Marcos victims. Talk to us about those.
Well, some were very straightforward. For example, the house in Makiki Heights that he lived in with Imelda, that is in Hawaii. Although that was, again, a contested proceeding, we managed to recover $1 million on that because it was not in Marcos's name. It was in someone else's name. We recovered the car, the Mercedes that he drove in Hawaii. That was a small recovery, about $30,000. After that, we recovered money from real estate in the Fort Worth, Texas area.
Yeah.
Again, not in his name, and which was claimed by Jose Campos and his children. After that, we were able to recover money based on Imelda's artwork, notably a very valuable Picasso painting, one of Monet, not Picasso, but Monet,
Yeah.
water lily paintings. We recovered a total of, about $23 million based on the Marcos artwork. Again, it was in the United States.
So these recoveries clearly prove that there were stolen assets by the Marcoses. That's basic.
Well, it's very difficult for me or the Philippine government to determine what is stolen and what is simply part of the Marcos wealth. The Philippine government and the PCG in particular have taken the position that all Marcos wealth belongs to the government. I don't agree with that because Marcos had wealth before he became president.
But how did they distinguish between what was stolen and what was not? Because based on the 2003 Supreme Court ruling here in the Philippines, the rest of the wealth that they had, the couple, I mean, outside of the 300,000 something legitimate income that they had while in government, was considered ill-gotten because that could not be explained.
Well, that's an advantage the Philippine government has. It appoints its own judges. Then the 2003 judgment, which focused on the Swiss bank accounts, was based on a calculation beginning in 1965 and ending in 1986. But the class wasn't permitted to be in that case. And if we had, we would have raised some issues as to how much Marcos wealth there was in 1965. It's assumed that Marcos never told the truth, but the courts have adjudicated that, well, the 1965 statement of Marcos' assets must be accurate. I would contest that. Also, there were a number of people who contributed to Marcos's political campaigns. And so that was legitimate money that Marcos could keep for himself if he didn't spend in the elections. Nonetheless, the Philippine courts didn't take that into consideration. So there are some issues with it. And the justice that wrote the opinion in 2003 was himself impeached a number of years later
2012.
For ill-gotten wealth. So there is a litany of problems that have occurred over a number of years in the effort to recover Marcos' wealth by the government.
Okay, but in the first place, how come the Hawaii class action suit ruling is not recognized here in the Philippines?
Well, with regard to the 1995 judgment, the Court of Appeals decided that it knew American law better than the judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals, and therefore it contested whether they had made the correct decision. Unfortunately, that is not consistent with Philippine law, which limits the basis on which a foreign judgment could be attacked.
Okay. How about the Arelma accounts? Talk to us about this. You're talking of around $40 million. Is that correct?
It's about $40 million.
So what are the Arelma accounts?
Right, and the history of it is that I first heard about it in the year 2000. The Philippine government had been aware of it since 1986. The money was at Merrill Lynch. And after I sued Merrill Lynch then deposited the money in the court in Hawaii, and it invited a number of parties to come in and contest ownership, including the Philippine government. What happened, though, was that the Philippine government, because it lacked evidence of its claim, it took the position that it was entitled to be dismissed based on sovereign immunity. And it also claimed that it was an indispensable party. That claim was rejected in the district court, rejected in the Court of Appeals, but the US Supreme Court accepted that and then reversed the judgment, which had been in favor of the class members.
So how close or far away are you from recovering these Arelma accounts or
Christian,
deposits?
Right. The funny thing is the Philippine courts have not approved the US judgments that I obtained, and yet they are in the position of asking a US court to accept and approve its own forfeiture judgment obtained in 2009 with regard to the Arelma account. And it's doing that with the assistance of the US Department of Justice.
And basically, some people might be asking, what's wrong if it's the Philippine government that recovers the Arelma deposits and not the Hawaii class action suit members and attorney Robert Swift? What's the difference?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, what's the difference whether the money goes to class members or to the Philippine government?
Yeah.
Well, because the class members have not been properly compensated for any significant part of the judgment they obtained. At the same time, the Philippine government, which has yet to prove that this is stolen money, has already recovered on its part more than $4 billion.
Okay. And of course, we know that during the second Aquino administration, there was this landmark law here in the Philippines, the Human Rights Recognition and Reparation Act, basically recognizing the atrocities committed by Marcos's martial law against thousands of Filipinos. And they have been compensated, right? So talk to us the difference between those who benefited from that law. They actually received a corresponding amount based on the kind of physical and emotional, psychological damage that they got during martial law, and the class members of the Hawaii suit.
I was very pleased with the legislation, but you have to draw a distinction between the judgment that was obtained in Hawaii on behalf of a discrete class of 9,539 versus the legislation, which is much broader and also had far more money to distribute. So I was very pleased that some of those who received money were in fact my class members. I also think there never would have been that legislation that would have been passed in the Philippine government, but for my success in proving the liability of Ferdinand Marcos for human rights abuses.
No, I think one basic question back then, when this distribution was about to begin, or while the government was trying to identify who was supposed to receive specific amounts under that law, one basic question was, couldn't we just adopt the list of the class members in Hawaii? Because they had been established as victims of martial law. How come that was not the case?
Well, what happened with the legislation is that they wanted to define the group of people eligible to recover money much broader than simply the members of the class in the Hawaii case. I don't take issue with that, but uh, there are differences, and in the U.S., the only people I could represent were those who were tortured, summarily executed, or disappeared.
Mhm. Attorney Swift, how long have you been doing this effort to enforce the judgment? And even before that, you started this earlier, right? How long have you been doing this?
Uh, I've been working on this case for 36 years.
36 years. Now, what keeps you going? It's been 36 years.
I've met more than 6,000 of the class members. I have strong feelings for wanting to do justice for them. I've been disappointed, for example, with the PCPG and its efforts. At times, I think they simply lack humanity. And, they should have some humanitarian interest in wanting to see the class members properly compensated. I continued to fight, and every day I work on the case to make sure that there will be a fourth distribution.
So there had been 3 distributions so far. I think my question earlier was what was the difference between whether it's the government or the actual victims based on the Hawaii ruling would receive the amounts or the assets. I think if you talk about your effort, the money goes directly to the victims, right?
It does. It does. And one of the aspects of class actions in the United States is that any distribution is controlled by the court. I've also actually taken it a step further, which is that I've been integrally involved in a hands-on way in each of the distributions to make sure that each class member that receives a check is the correct person that's entitled to it. In other words, we're not passing money through a bureaucracy. It's going directly to the victims, and it's supervised by a court in the U.S.
And how many of the class members? I think there were 9,536. Is that correct?
9,539.
39. Okay, I missed it by 3. That is very important. How many of them have actually died?
Quite a few. And so we're dealing with relatives. But that's all right, because we basically do substitutions of class members, and we make sure that there's distribution within families. So if, let's say, the head of household is a man with a wife and children, he's survived by his wife. The wife dies, but there's 6 children. We make sure that whoever the representative is distributes the money within the family.
Okay. And with 9 years to go before 2031, how much of the assets do you think you can still reasonably and realistically recover?
At the moment, I'm constrained to only being able to execute on monies that's in the United States. If that were to change, and for example, there are court hearings coming up later this month dealing with the contempt judgment. If I'm able to execute in the Philippines, then I would certainly go after Marcos property in the Philippines.
Okay. Again, how much is the contempt judgment?
Currently, it's about $360 million.
$360 million. And that accumulates over time, right?
Well, it bears interest.
Mm-mm. And who are covered by this judgment?
Imelda Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and the estate of Ferdinand E. Marcos.
Mm-mm. And does this mean that because of this contempt judgment, they cannot go to the United States, or they can, but it would be a tedious process?
Well, for example, if Bongbong is elected president, he can come to the United States, and he may well come to the United States. Under some circumstances, I can subpoena him and require him to testify as to his own wealth and the wealth of his mother and the estate of Ferdinand E. Marcos.
There's no immunity at all, even if he was a sitting president of the Philippines and he decides to go there.
Well, as president of the Philippines, he would be entitled to diplomatic immunity. But not everything that an official does in the United States is entitled to diplomatic immunity. So, for example, if he goes shopping at Tiffany's, I can serve him with a subpoena and force him to testify
And how would you force him to testify?
by going into a court and asking the court to hold him in contempt if he refuses.
And then he can be blocked from leaving the United States. Would that be the scenario?
A court would have that power. There's an
Okay.
example of Karadžić from Serbia, who was served with a subpoena in the United States, and it was at a time he was doing a fundraiser. And even though he was the head of a country, the court held that he was subject to the subpoena because his activity was not diplomatic.
Okay. Now, for those who are not familiar with this contempt judgment, what was the nature of that? Why were they cited in contempt?
Well, it goes back to an injunction that I obtained during the course of the litigation, which prohibited the Marcoses from transferring any of the assets of Ferdinand E. Marcos during the litigation.
But they did.
They violated that by entering into 2 or more agreements with the Philippine government to divide and transfer the assets of the estate. The U.S. court held them in contempt. I required them to testify. They refused to testify. They also refused to turn over documents. So the U.S. court then assessed a penalty of $100,000 a day until they consented to testifying in the case, and also disclaiming the agreements that they had made with the Philippine government.
Is
They
that
were-
amount? Is that amount? We know that accumulates every day, right? Can that be negotiated? Is there some sort of an amnesty, just like in taxes?
Well, the
Meaning, can they
nature of
negotiate
it,
with the U.S. court as to the amount that needs to be paid?
it's actually very easy. As soon as they consent to doing what the U.S. court has required, then the penalty is no longer assessed.
Meaning they don't have to pay that huge amount, which is accumulating by the day.
At the time, they could have simply testified, turned over documents, and that would have been the end of it. But they didn't. And it continued for 10 years to the year 2005. And in subsequent years, the court entered a judgment in the amount of $253.6 million, which with interest is now larger.
So by now, so today they have no choice but to settle that.
Well, they're responsible to to pay the judgment, but they've thumbed their nose at the U.S. court and they have not paid anything on the judgment.
Okay. Now, the last time we spoke with the former PCGG officials, and we also asked them about the prospects of a Bongbong Marcos presidency. The common response was you could expect that the PCGG could even be abolished or drastically reduced in terms of mandate or rendered inutile or irrelevant under a Marcos presidency. In your case, you are conducting a parallel effort to enforce the judgment. Do you think that would have an effect also in your effort? Meaning, if Bongbong Marcos wins the presidency?
Well, I think there are two things that are most likely to happen under a Marcos presidency. First, Bongbong is going to abolish the PCEG. Why would he continue a presidential department that is solely focused on recovering his family's wealth? Secondly, the United States U.S. Department of Justice, I think, will quickly lose interest in the realm of monies that it's trying to obtain for the Philippine government once there's a Marcos presidency. After all, what's the point of trying to recover Marcos' allegedly ill-gotten wealth only to return it to Marcos?
To the government. The
Well,
government which is headed by Marcos.
exactly.
Okay. So on that note, thank you very much, Attorney Bob, Robert Swift, for joining us on this podcast. Keep safe, sir. You have been doing this for so long.
Okay, well, thank you, Christian. It's always good to speak with you.
Okay. And that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining us on our Facts First podcast. I'm your host, Christian Esguerra. You can catch this episode on my YouTube channel and also click like and subscribe to my channel. Now, the podcast version can be accessed through Apple, Spotify, Google, and Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until the next episode, thank you very much.